Right, well, perhaps I'd better just explain where we are and when. We've just done a matinee. We being Colin Baker, who's playing the Doctor, and I'm David Banks, who's playing Carl, the mercenary villain. We've done a matinee of the ultimate adventure, and we've found this rather cavernous function room. We've asked the people in the distance to move away and be quiet as possible, but if you hear any sounds, it's security guards walking around, chatting to each other, drinking coffee. Now, Colin, when we were chatting just a moment ago, I said people like to talk about themselves. And you said, of course they do, of course. So one of the first questions I was thinking of was to ask you, do you like to be interviewed?
I suppose I must, otherwise I wouldn't do it quite so often as I do. I think actually what happens is you do an awful lot of thinking when you're being interviewed.
Yeah.
There are a great many issues or ideas that I don't actually think about until my mouth is moving. And once the mouth is moving, the brain kind of rushes along to catch up and says, hang on, I've got to supply you with some information to come out of the mouth. So I find at the end of an interview, I can sometimes know more about myself than I did before.
Yes.
Which is presumably the same of
That's right.
same as the people talking to me.
You said that you wanted to ask about David Banks the man rather than David Banks the actor. And my response to that was, yes, I would like to find out as well. And I think for those very same reasons, that it's impossible to think in an abstract way, think in a vacuum. But presumably, you are very used to being interviewed, more than anybody else, more than any other doctor, because the feeling I get is that you are very open to fans, that when you first became the Doctor, you actually embraced it wholeheartedly, and you took on all that rigmarole, sometimes tiring rigmarole, of seeing the fans, going to a lot of conventions, making yourself available to them, answering all their letters, and being interviewed. I suppose part of that process has happened with you, that you have discovered a lot about yourself through the good ministrations of the fans.
Yes, well, the other thing that also happens, though, unfortunately, is that because, with the best will in the world, when one is being interviewed by anybody, they are going to overlap in the areas in which they question you. That one hears oneself not just giving the same answer, which is understandable. I mean, if the answer is black and the question is, what's the colour of your shirt, and you say black. But I use exactly the same words now. So I tell anecdotes in exactly the same way because I've done it so often. And it's trying to break out of that's when being interviewed becomes, tedious is the wrong word, because like doing a play. You do a play night after night after night. In theory, that's tedious, except it's never the same. It is always different, and therefore it's not. So every interview is different, and that person is hearing it for the first time. But nonetheless, I have to work quite hard sometimes just to push myself down a different avenue, and sometimes to give an untruthful answer.
Yes.
What's your favourite story? I'm sick of saying two doctors, so I'll say something else.
Yes. That's raised two very interesting issues. One of them is something that I try to tackle as a substructure to my book, Cyberman, which is the notion of the truth of our experiences, the truth of our memories of our experiences. And it seems to me that all memory is a fiction. The way that we recall things is just a way of bringing it into focus. In order to bring it into focus, we have to tell certain lies, in a way. Fiction is a telling of a story, but it also is a manipulation of the experience that we've had. And to make it, just to finish, make it into the story, the anecdote, it can no longer be the raw experience that we went through. And if you are to repeat it in the way that you said, you found yourself repeating over and over again the form of words that have become solid. If you are going to do that, in fact, what you're wedding yourself to is a lie, to put it at its most basic. I'm not saying that that's wrong, I'm just saying that that's a phenomenon that people perhaps are not quite aware of. They think that there is some absolute truth about the experience that we've passed through, and say when the fans ask us questions about the stories that we've done, the facts about those stories become enshrined in fan lore. And the thing is that quite often one person's memory of a story contradicts with another person's memory. And when the fans get those two contradictions, they think one of them is not telling the truth or it's a bad memory or something. But it's more likely to be the fact that the experience which has come together in that one person's mind has coalesced around one particular fiction, and for the other person around another particular fiction. Both fictions are equally valid. In the Cyberman book, I tried to tackle it with the fictions of the Cyberman stories. There are inconsistencies in the facts of the Cyberman stories because they're written by different writers. But if we treat those inconsistencies in the same way that we treat the inconsistencies of people's remembered truths, remembered facts, take the tension between them which exists in the inconsistency between two people's viewpoints, you get a very rich area where a different kind of truth, a synthesis of truth, comes out.
Yeah. No, I mean, all I was going to interrupt you about earlier was the fact that it's so dangerous to use the word lie, because lie implies a kind of decision to distort the truth.
Yes.
And it's a conscious, deliberate thing. And I think very few of us do that, actually. We don't tell lies.
No. I retract that. I was trying to shock, I suppose. I was trying to challenge.
It's about structuring. It's like the whole process of dreams, really. I mean, there are theories that the whole dream process that we go through most nights for a certain period of time is the brain sorting out information, sorting out bits that have happened yesterday, the day before, 10 years ago, shoving them to a different bit of the library. And I think that's what happens sometimes with us when people ask us, what happened when you're making that story? And you get a jumble of what you think you remember, what other people have told you you remember. There are a lot of things I claim to remember about my childhood because my mother has told me, do you remember that time when? And she's told me that repeatedly over the 40-odd years I've been around. And I'm not sure whether I remember it or not, because along with all the names and the places come images. So it's not just words. It's not like remembering words in a book. It is, the memory is a funny thing. It's full of little eidetic things as well as symbols.
Yes, eidetic. You use the word eidetic sometimes in the show. Eidetic
Yes.
memory as you go down the time tunnel.
Yes. Well, memory for me is eidetic and olfactory, actually. Here's another long
You should
word.
explain this.
I find smells very evocative.
Yes, which is olfactory.
Yes, and I can go back to places that I haven't been to since I was a child, and the thing that I remember most is not the look of the place, or the sound of the place, or the size or the shape of the place. It's the smells of childhood. I mean, talking about it now, I get a shiver down the spine, thinking about that particular combination of the area where I come from, just outside Rochdale in Lancashire. And it's the combination of trees and mown grass and all sorts of little tiny smells. And we undervalue it as a sense. It's quite extraordinary. It's only when we have conversations like this, people will tend to agree with you. Yes, it is. It smells. And also images in the mind, the way my mother looked when I was young.
Yes.
I can see the pram, but I can't remember any incidents.
Yes.
I can feel what it's like now to be in that pram.
Well, tell us a little. You've taken us now back to your childhood. So it was near Rochdale, was it, that you were born?
Yes, I was born in London on Waterloo Bridge, which is quite a feat, isn't it? Well, the south end of Waterloo Bridge, there's a hospital called the Royal Waterloo Lying-In Hospital.
Yes.
And in the summer of 1943, when that worthy gentleman from Germany was attempting to obliterate London, for some reason they had the maternity ward on the top floor of the Royal Waterloo Hospital. And I was born on the top floor of a hospital at the south end of Waterloo Bridge during an air raid, which is quite clever, really, wasn't it? I survived that, and I survived houses around me being blown up. I got bits of shrapnel that embedded themselves in my infant cot when I was...
But not in this particular infant.
Not in this infant, no. There's one bit that actually did end up in the wood of the cot. Stockwell, I was brought up in London. And at the end of those 2 years, which I, to be honest, remember very little about, my father came back in 1946, I think, from service with the First Army in Africa, which, like all fathers, he was at pains to say absolutely nothing about the rest of his life. It's extraordinary, that reticence. I think if I'd been involved in a conflict like that, I'd have wanted to tell everybody about it all the time. So there's a process you must go through when you go through war that makes you want to really shut it off. Anyway, he came back and returned to the job that he had been doing before. He was manager of an asbestos factory. And they'd moved the factory up north, just outside Rochdale. My father's been dead now for over 15 years. And the whole asbestos scare has happened since his demise, thank goodness, because the very factory that he was managing director of for a long time is the one where the majority of the asbestosis cases in the north came from, which is quite horrific. And of course, he would have known nothing about it any more than anybody else did. So yes, I found myself as a 3-year-old, plucked from London and deposited in Rochdale. And that's when acting started. When I went to school at the age of 5,
That early.
I was talking London at home, But that was regarded as posh, you see, at a Rochdale Milltown primary school. So I was talking like that at school, and in the 400 yards between school and home, my linguistic talents underwent a change. The birth of acting. The confusing times came when children came home, which I tried to engineer to happen as little as possible.
Yes.
I'm not saying that my parents would have beaten me to a pulp if I'd spoken with a northern accent, but in the child brain, there's a lot of confusion about those sort of things.
Is this a memory that you definitely had, or is it something that your parents...
That is one I do remember.
Yeah.
I do remember for a combination of reasons, partly because of the way I spoke, which was unacceptable. The way I would naturally speak at home was unacceptable at school, and vice versa. The school was more important because, I mean, that really was go home with a bloody nose because you're different. It's mere fact of being different. Yeah. And we were in a very deprived area, and I came from what would be regarded now as middle-class stock. So I didn't have clogs. I mean, there were clogs around. I didn't have clogs. My dad did not work at the mill and come home covered in bits of cotton. I did have a tie and a shirt. I was a very neatly turned out little boy, which was the worst thing to do, to send to a rough primary school. So I was a, I'm a wonderful victim. And I wore glasses, and I was undersized until I was about 16. I was always the smallest in my class. Small glasses, a bit of a swat. I like reading, talk different. Oh dear, I mean.
I can just picture it now.
So I learned to entertain. I mean, the way I could get out of a lot of trouble was by making them laugh. I mean, we've heard that story so many times.
And this is true for you. You can remember that. Remember that
Yes.
process. Remember your thoughts
Yes.
about it, and putting that external on you, that external persona of being the clown. Almost.
Yeah. I mean, mine was more words. I wasn't the buffoon in the sense of... What I did do was learn that if you cheek the teachers, you get the respect of your classmates. So I was the witty one that every teacher must dread, who comes back with a witty riposte, and I was always being given punishments for it. But I didn't mind being punished by the teachers, because that was a kind of badge of honour. It was the school chums you didn't want to regard you with any disfavour. Yeah. In fact, in my first 5 years, I changed school 3 times because of bullying. I mean, my mother was perhaps too protective, bless her. I don't know. But, I mean, the first school I was only out for 2 years, and it was just awful. I mean, I had a constant bloody nose. And I had a lot of trouble in later life breathing, because the amount of times my nose had been bloodied and there was so much scar tissue in there. I had to have an operation about 3 years ago, actually, to finally enable me to breathe clearly through my nose, all dating back to that time.
It goes on so much, doesn't it, bullying?
Yeah, and there was a time when I did grow, when I was 16 and I was at grammar school, and I had been bullied, and suddenly I grew, and I was, within a space of a year, I went from being the smallest to almost the biggest in the class. It was a strange growth spurt, and I found myself bullying. And it was the release from being bullied, and I'd actually taken a boy's cap off and thrown it in the bushes, and he was standing crying in front of me. And as I was doing this act of bullying, I mean, it doesn't sound horrendous now, taking a chap's cap off and throwing it in the bushes, but that was, that was the sum total of my... And I suddenly felt enormous, because I saw myself there. I mean, I suppose it's quite rare at that age to actually have the imagination to realise, hang on a minute, that was me a year ago. And I confused the poor little chap enormously by apologising to him. I'm terribly sorry, I'll go get it back for you. And that scared him, I think, more than the bullying, because I departed from the kind of the accepted paths on which you trod.
So how did it go on from there? Did you accept bullying? What was your reaction when people bullied you? Obviously,
I cried, actually.
You cried and bled.
Yes.
But later on, when you got in a position of bullying other people, did that change other people's attitudes to you, or your attitudes to the bully? Were you able to stand up the better to the bully because you'd bullied and you'd found out that you could bully and then apologise?
Well, I'd always stood up to the bully. That was my mistake. I would if they said, "Who are you looking at?" Even if he was 10 feet tall and twice as wide as me, I would say, "I certainly wouldn't look at you. You're much too ugly." And I get thumped. I never learned. I've never been able to keep my mouth shut, ever. I've had a very strong sense of justice ever since I was old enough to know that there were such things as justice. And I have never been able to suppress what I consider my right to be me for the sake of saving myself having a bloody nose. Now, some people will call that crass stupidity. I don't know. It's like all through life I've stood up against the ones I should be quiet with. Directors, all sorts of people. If necessary, if I've considered it necessary.
But what about your mother? You mentioned your father. Did your pugnaciousness come from your mother, perhaps? Or from your father?
My mother was a very outgoing person. She was a teacher. She was one of the first Montessori teachers. My mother, she trained in Montessori.
But you didn't go
She
to
was
that
no,
education.
no, I didn't.
But obviously you were influenced by her ideas about how
Yes.
schools should be brought up.
I mean, I remember she was always great fun at home. I mean, there was lots of things to do, and I'm not saying that she was, let's sit down and with this paper plate and this piece of string, let's make a little jolly snowman to hang up. It wasn't like that. But she and I were the ones who had the, for instance, when we went to the seaside, we went to Thornton Cleveleys, which is midway between Blackpool and Fleetwood on the northwest coast. We went there for our holidays for many years in succession. And she and I used to go and watch Charlie Parsons, who was an entertainer. They used to have about 4 or 5 little theatres down the front. I mean, I'm talking about the early 50s now. Down the front in places like Cleveleys, 2 or 3 folderols, follies, variety shows going on all the time. I mean, if you think of the wealth of opportunity in those days, if you were an entertainer, as opposed to, it was certainly true of actors as well. There were repertory theatres everywhere, or repertoire theatres, especially in the summer. We used to go and watch this chap, Charlie Parsons, with his group of a dozen people in a little 200-seater on the front in the open air, and we used to stand there for hours on end watching that. We both had a great love of theatre and adored it. Whereas my brother, who is 6 years older than I, Michael, and my father, who was a quieter man, more, I suppose he was more cerebral, really. He could have been a very talented musician, I am told, by those who knew him when he was young, but chose to go out and support his mum instead, which is very admirable. They pooh-poohed all that, and they'd rather go for good walks in the country. But my mother and I were always in tune on the fripperies of life. We liked watching the clowns entertain.
So acting was quite an early influence there. You were aware of actors. Were you aware, apart from the, I was going to say lies again, I would say that, apart from the persona that you put on when you were 5, were you aware that you wanted to be an actor?
No, not at all. It never occurred to me. It's a bit like, I don't know, watching runners run or boxers box. In those days, those are things that other people did and that you watch. It never occurred to me that I could be a participant in something that other people would want to watch or care about.
So when did that come?
Well, that came as a result of the school that I found myself at when I was 11. I got the 11 plus, and it was quite an event there. I mean, I'm saying this not in any vainglorious way, because to get the 11 plus, I don't consider it to be that phenomenal. It was simply a selection exam at that time, which dictated which branch of education you went into. If you passed 11 plus, you went to a grammar school. If you didn't, you went to what they call technical schools or secondary moderns. And I was the only person in my school who got the 11 plus, which is an indication of the fact probably that my mother had been working away at me in the background. And the school had a half holiday because somebody from that school had actually got the 11 plus. Now, I mean, you would expect at least half of children of any school to pass 11 plus. It showed you the kind of school I was at. So I went to St Bede's College in Manchester, and that was a culture shock, because suddenly I was having to travel 15 miles on the bus to go there, as opposed to half a mile before.
So you didn't board? You
No.
actually travelled there every day?
Yes, into Manchester and across Manchester and back again. I mean, I'm appalled now to think that at that age I was responsible. I don't know whether you do that now, because they have school buses now. But it meant 3 changes of bus, coming back in the winter, getting home about 6 o'clock after travelling all that way in a bus. Anyway, it was a smashing school. And each year we used to do a Gilbert and Sullivan opera. It didn't occur to me to go into that either, until the 2 chaps I was chumming around with, these are the wonderful old-fashioned words, so that they wanted to do it. So I just turned up after school for rehearsals for the Yeoman of the Guard and found myself in the chorus and enjoyed it enormously, as a girl, of course. And this is very deeply worrying stuff, an all-boys school, and I was a girl in the Yeoman. The following year, for some reason I can't quite fathom, I think it was the acting ability rather than the singing, I was cast as Phyllis in Aranthe, and which is the leading soprano part.
Your voice hadn't broken by this
No,
time.
no, I was 12 then. And this is a story I've told often, so it's one of those stories I was telling you about that comes out pat. But it is true, because I've finally managed to get hold of very recently a copy of the review, and it is exactly as I remembered it. That the English master, a man called A.W. Martin, Spike was his nickname, who I mention by name because he was one of the great influences of mine. He loved words and articulate people. He was very articulate himself. And he made me love English language, and I've loved it ever since. And he reviewed Iolanthe in the school magazine, and he said that Colin Baker threw himself with great verve into the part of Phyllis and rarely strayed more than half an octave from the note. And at the time, I hadn't got a clue what an octave was. I thought, hey, look at this, I rarely strayed. It was only with the kind of hindsight and wisdom of later years that I realised that there was an implied criticism there. And I'm afraid my singing voice has always been erratic. I tend to go with the melody, whatever I'm supposed to be singing. From there I went to, the next year was Ruddigore, and I played Rose Maybud in Ruddigore, which is the female lead again. Then The Voice broke, had a year out, and then played Pish Tush in The Mikado. So I had 4 or 5 years of doing that sort of, just the Gilbert and Sullivan. But the interesting thing is we also had a debating society which was compulsory at the school. Every Friday afternoon from upper fourth upwards, you had to go along to the debate. And there were 2 people proposing, nominated by the headmaster, and 2 opposing. And during the term you had to speak, get up and speak in debate at least once. I dreaded that. I absolutely dreaded it. Each time I prepared something and each time I bottled out until it always got to the last day of term, and then the headmaster would have a record of who had spoken and call upon all those who hadn't spoken. And I would get up and I would blush and I would stammer and I would be terrified and inarticulate. Put me in a costume with a wig on, playing Phyllis or Rose Maybud, and I had no compunctions whatsoever. Let psychologists make of it what they will. I suppose it's actually, all it says is that one doesn't actually have the confidence in oneself to say that my opinions are worth listening to. I have no such problems now, I hasten to add. I think my opinions are extremely interesting now and thrust them down people's throats. But that's because I've had 20 years of being an actor and 20 years of gradually discovering that, through various processes actually, first of all that, hey, you know, I'm famous, I'm on telly, listen to what I'm saying. And then thinking, hang on a minute, because I'm famous and on telly, it doesn't make my opinion worth any more than it did before. But if I just kind of suppress that and come halfway between the two, everybody has a right to be heard. And now I can push the embarrassment to one side. I quite enjoy having the opportunity when I do, but I don't force it on people, I hope.
It's a question that's often asked, why one became an actor. I remember being challenged by a good friend at university who suggested it was exhibitionism. And I still can't work out the strands of being an actor. In your description of your childhood, growing up, being in these amateur operatics and so on, you've more or less described the principal facets that I would have put down to the Doctor. I'd call the Doctor fiercely just. We've talked about this before, that you seem to have this fierce justice in you. And it's something to do with that bully as well, the bully in you and the bully that bloodied your nose. And the forgiveness, the apology, rather, the forgiveness that you wanted to seek from the person that you bullied.
Yeah.
It became possible for you to mete out justice. The humour, the bad jokes, a buffoon, not in a stupid sense, but to be able to set yourself up because you have the confidence to take the blows that other people would mete out to you. You can ride those now. You're out there trying to seek justice for everybody, yourself included. You've got huge energy and a quicksilver mind, and what you've described there in being able to talk, in the influence of your teacher, is evidently a good influence there, that he was interested in articulacy, in quickness of thought. The confidence that is growing is perhaps not so easily explained. You're not an exhibitionist. You had to hide behind characters, as you said. Now, through use of hiding behind characters, you've almost become a character yourself. This fiction that you created for yourself is sufficient to hide behind. So perhaps it's not exhibitionism. It's not, you're not a fantasist. You're a creative artist. You actually create your character, create the character of the Doctor, create the other parts of the play. And there has come kind of synthesis there, hasn't there?
Yes. I think one thing that happens as a result of being an actor that a lot of people know, therefore, when I walk into a room, because of two series in particular, because of The Brothers and Doctor Who, it covers a kind of broad spectrum of the population of this country. So there are going to be some people in that room who know who I am. And whether it's desirable or not, that means that people will be more likely to have an attitude, one way or the other, i.e. he is famous, therefore I want to listen to him, or he is famous and therefore I'm not going to pay any attention to him at all because I don't want him thinking he's important because he's famous. But at least there is a positive attitude. When I was younger and had no crutch of fame, if you like, to help me stagger into a room, I was the sort of person who did not dominate. I was the one who said, waiter, and they walked right past, as opposed to the one who said, wait up, and they didn't. And I suspect I'm still that sort of person, really.
Sorry.
Other people do it for me, though. Other people, the waiter is hovering, waiting for me to say something now, so that he can come and wait upon me. And it's absolutely nothing to do with me at all. I'm probably not by nature a dominant person, actually. And the key to that occurs in this particular business that we both work in. I love being, it sounds awful, the top of the bill. I like being the Doctor in Doctor Who, because to that extent the atmosphere that we work in is largely dictated by me. And I like a pleasant atmosphere. I like to work with people who are happy and relaxed, and I can't bear unpleasant atmospheres. Now, I've been in as a kind of number 2, 3 and 4 in jobs where the star in that particular show thrives only on the fact of making everybody else feel uncomfortable. And there's nothing I can do about that, because I am not where the buck stops. I am not the person that, for whatever reasons of fate or casting, is at the top of that particular pyramid. And I love being at the top, not because of me, but because as a result of that, the whole thing is under my wing. Do you
Yes,
understand what I'm saying?
I do. You become a benign dictator because you know yourself.
Yes.
You trust the
Yes,
dictates
that's what it is.
you put out to other people.
But I'm because I've been talking about how I've come to be an actor, which is largely by chance. It's a combination of things that happened in my childhood, having a mother who liked theatre, learning quite early that submerging your own personality and assuming another one helped you through life, a modicum of success within the small world of a school in drama, and then a subsequent coincidence where I was sitting with my mother watching The King and I at the Palace Theatre in Manchester, and I said to her, I'd love to have a go at something like that, and the man in front turns round and says, I am the chairman of the local amateur dramatic society, why don't you come along next Friday? Which I did, which led to amateur theatre, which led to the gradual process of deciding I'm going to go for it and become a professional. Now, I'm quite clear about how that happened. I know there isn't a desire really to show off or to be exhibitionist. Those are kind of words that I don't think there are many actors who want to show off. I think what happens is you find you have a talent, something which other people respond to. Therefore, you want to do it again, like a dog does a trick. It's not a deliberate desire to dominate other people by it. It's simply a way that your personality can shine out. Others find their other ways. What about you? How did yours happen?
Well, I suppose I had a very early feeling that I should be a performer in some way. I was an only child. I had thought perhaps it was something to do with that if you're an only child, then attention from the parents comes down onto that one child. Everything that one child does is preeminent, and the parents are very proud of it, normally. In the same regard, if you do something wrong, then the wrath of the parents come down on that, and you take all the responsibility, all the blame. I felt that I could do those kind of things. I could stand up and say witty, charming things, be laughed at, be held in awe in a certain way, because there was nobody else to compare me with. I think it's very unfair in a way, but if you say intelligent things when you're 4 or 5, then you're kind of held up.
But most children at the age of 4 or 5 are often the only child, and others come along subsequently. So it can't be the only childness of
yeah,
it,
but
can
nobody
it?
Nobody else came along subsequently.
Yes.
But that was I suppose, my early experience. And when I got to school, 3, 4, 5, I went to nursery school. I was bigger than everybody else, and I tended to knock people over, accidentally.
Accidentally, I'm glad you said that.
But people thought that it wasn't. When I say accidentally, I mean that I wanted to get something. you know, I still had that rawness. I wanted to, that thing should be mine, and the person in front of me should be pushed aside for it.
And you were successful at the pushing aside.
Successful because I was just bigger. But people thought this was something that had to be dealt with, and so I was seen as the bad boy there, the bully, although I didn't have any intentions of bullying. And so I was kind of brought aside and told that that wasn't the thing to do. I mustn't do it. I'd be punished if I did. So I tended to withdraw into myself. I tended to not push, not predominate in that way, and in turn was bullied myself for quite a few years.
Must have been some brave people to bully you, David.
Well, because they knew that I wouldn't hit back.
Yes.
They would be seen to be very brave. One occasion when I did try and stop the bullying, and I hit out in my turn, I again was seen as the perpetrator of the bullying. So again, I was brought up to the teacher and told that this wasn't the way to behave. In fact, I was shown a dictionary. The teacher said, it's provocation. Do you know what to provoke means? And I didn't. I was about 7 at the time. And so he got at it. I remember in our brown old school dictionary and opened it up and had to provoke. And it meant to instigate him, to start. And I was the person that meant to start all that violence.
Oh, you were the provoker?
I was.
Oh, I thought you were pleading provocation.
I was called the provoker.
By your mere existence, obviously.
Yeah. So I had, I suppose, quite deeply embedded in me the feeling that I had hardly to act. I mean, act in the sense of to cause things to happen, because if I did, they would come back at me. I suppose until I was about 10, I really was a person who could be bullied quite easily. And then at the age of 10, I went to a school in Birmingham, a private school. I wasn't doing very well at school, I think partly because of the bullying. Interesting, we both had backgrounds. Yes. It was my uncle, a very small school. My uncle ran it. He was the headmaster. There were only about 15 people in the school, a very small private school. And they ranged from a 10-year-old, and I was 10 as well, to 15, 16-year-olds. An interesting mix to be in. I was there for a year. But the other 10-year-old started to bully me. See, these signs were picked up. And the others, the 14, 15-year-old, turned around and said, look, you're much bigger than him. Why are you letting him do that? And suddenly my rage was let out at this other 10-year-old. And I found I could dominate him very easily, that I had enough physical strength. I had the rage inside me, I suppose, was rage to do with what had happened before when I was being bullied and didn't do anything about it. And in a similar way to you, I very quickly became aware that that was a wrong thing, a wrong position to be in. That position of domination, of meting out violence on somebody else, made me feel bad and didn't help the situation. What good did it do if I had a whimpering wreck, that I could send on errands or tell to shut up? Or I remember actually being in bed. We shared this room, and we were in our separate beds in the dark, and he was talking, and I would say things like, if you don't shut up, there's going to be another 2 hits tomorrow. And I remember writing on the wallpaper of that bedroom, and in the morning, 36 hits had been written down, and I meted them out. Suddenly I became aware that that's not the way to behave, that you can't continue a relationship. The relationship is absolutely unequal. As long, and this is what I very much agree with you, and I think my experience aligns itself with what you described, that there's got to be a balance, that perhaps if you're strong enough, then you can hold that balance, you can see that balance kept. If you're in a dominating position, then you can allow other people to come up equal to you, and you can allow other imbalances that are going on to be made more equal. You started off by asking me about acting, and I've started...
But these are all the things that, well, they may not cause us to be actors, but
No, they're
it's
all
interesting to
there.
compare.
Yes.
I mean, we might talk to two stockbrokers tomorrow who give us exactly the same stories, and they ended up as stockbrokers.
Yeah.
I suspect that an awful lot of people would claim, again, back to the memory thing, to have been bullied at school.
Yes, I don't think it's to do with the acting, really. I remember that really it stemmed from this feeling of being important when I was young, and I suppose all of us feel that, unless we've had really very bad childhoods, being badly treated by our parents or whatever, or by life, by catastrophes of life. That basically, we start off from some kind of good golden age, and then we strike out from that. I think in my case, I have a certain reticence, a certain wanting to hold back, that is partly to do with being told early on that I shouldn't exert myself too much in the direction of other people, because that could end up as bad. But so, as far as acting is concerned, I think that it is to do, again, with inhabiting other characters where you can be furious. You can inhabit somebody else's rage without having your own rage to be responsible for example.
So this is acting as catharsis now, is it?
Well, yes, acting as yes, living in a fantasy world as escapism.
But cleansing yourself of things which would be dangerous hanging around inside your head if they
Well,
weren't allowed out.
Yes, I think it's not. I don't think it's that simple. I think perhaps in the first instance, it's very exhilarating to do that, to see other actors that we're influenced by. In my case, say Peter O'Toole, bursting out into a wonderful tirade, beautifully paced, beautifully technical, but still capturing that rage, which is sometimes a glory to behold. You know, we are very impressed by that kind of passion.
So am I to deduce that you came to acting through seeing other people do it, rather than through any process of doing it yourself?
No, I was very interested in acting, and I remember very early on being in little plays at school, being a wizard, for example, with an embroidered cloak and a silver capped cane. But for some reason, my teacher, when I was about 8, putting a script on my desk, for no reason at all I can think of, and saying, "There you are, David, you choose your actors and put that on." And suddenly it seemed to me that I was seen as a performer or somebody who was interested in acting, the theatre, something like that. Very, very odd that should suddenly happen, and I couldn't account for it. But I accepted that. When I went to secondary school, I started, it was a boys' school, and I started appearing in the school plays. I was very interested in drama and very interested in acting, in being on the stage. And it was Julius Caesar. And, I played Caesar's wife, Calpurnia. I got a little headline in the paper, boy 14 plays Caesar's wife. I'm not saying that's unusual, but for the person involved, it focuses, and it made me, as the person involved, see myself as carved out to be an actor. So from then on, when I was 11, I really, I suppose, felt that I ought to become an actor. I also wanted to write. I also wanted to be a scientist. I wanted to be an astronaut. I was really very interested in science fiction. And so those were the two sides of my interests. And I realized as I grew up to my O-levels and my A-levels that probably acting, it wasn't a very practical profession to pursue. And so I was prepared to continue my academic side. I was interested in theology. I had to let the sciences go because I, at that time, wasn't very good at maths, and I didn't take to the hard aspects, the hard facts of physics, biology, and chemistry. I much preferred the interesting tangles of English literature, say, where an essay, appreciating it, is inexact. You can't actually specify what you like about it. Say the character of Brutus. I remember writing about the character of Brutus and finding it fascinating. You could explore and explore and explore, keep on exploring, finding out the aspects of this man, and never get to a final conclusion about it.
And have two completely contrasting essays, both of which will get full marks, because they were both very good examinations of the character of a human being, even though they contradict each other, which you can't do with an exact science.
No.
I agree with you, absolutely.
No. And so, to get back to the acting as catharsis, it is, I think, at the beginning. A fan just the other day said, "Isn't it wonderful to be able to scream like that on stage?" And of course it is, but After 15 years or so in the profession, learning the technique of streaming on stage, it's like learning a language. When you hear the language and you don't know it, it sounds beautiful. When you've mastered the language, it's beautiful in a different way, but you can never get back, I don't think, to that appreciation of the language as unknown sounds. And in the same way, you can never get back really to that first delight of being able to get up on a stage and scream. There are other delights in acting, and I think once acting as catharsis is passed by, acting as exploration, almost as psychoanalysis, that we have the privilege as actors to be able to understand the character that we play. We've got to understand the character fully. We've got to love the character in a certain way. We can criticize him in aspects of our performance, but it seems to me that you can't create a full character unless you understand the workings and are prepared to justify them, which can get very difficult. I mean, especially playing Carl at the moment, somebody who's an utter mercenary, plays it just for money, does anything for money, doesn't matter what he does to other people.
But some of the best characters ever written have had that motivation. I mean, that needn't be a let or hindrance to making it an interesting character.
No, I'm not saying that.
An obsession or
Yes.
or an absolute rule of behaviour is fascinating because you then have to encounter that with the things that happen in life. And you've got this desire, principle, obsession with money, and all the time you're being presented with choices. I mean, it's a very interesting sounding board to bounce a character off.
Yes, but I'm talking about the principles of it. If one has a moral idea of how one should live, then for some people, they find it unacceptable that you should be representing something which perhaps is totally against that.
Yes.
So,
but I think actually, if the part were not better written, that's unfair to Terence Dicks, but if the play was called Carl the Mercenary, right, you'd probably find that it's the most interesting part in it, because Daleks are Daleks, Cybermen are Cybermen. We can talk about that for hours, can't we? The Doctor, in a sense, is the Doctor. But you are playing a sizable part in this of somebody who is one of the most pivotal characters in the piece. And if you've been given more than, I will exterminate the Doctor and leave it to me, and I'm going to go and get him now, chaps, if you had more interesting character lines than that, which I know is impossible in the piece we're doing, you'd probably find that Carl's one of the most interesting people in it.
I have found that.
Yeah.
It's coming to terms with the contradictions in the character. It happens, I think, in any character of any depth. Carl has depth because of what he represents on stage. He's a big man. He wears funny costumes.
You admit that, do you, David?
And I love it. He has this strange conversion when Delilah dies. He hasn't shown really any affection for Delilah very much, but obviously it's there. And out of that contradiction comes a tension, a kind of tension that I was talking about earlier, where a richness comes, a fruitfulness. But it's not just in Carl. It's happened in the Cyber Leader as well. You can't use your face. You can only use your voice and your body language. And you've got to play a character which is almost entirely non-human, almost entirely mechanical, but has a folk memory of being human, and is emotionless.
I'm going to embarrass you now, because I have said this to you many times before, and I said it to you when we were doing Attack of the Cybermen, that if you have 10 actors of the similar height inside cyber costumes, and I work with them, I will know instantly which one you're in, because you are the one with integrity. I mean, there may be others with integrity, but you have an absolute integrity. It tells the lie that you cannot act inside a costume, because you can. There are things, mimes know this from way back, mask mimes, that there is a way of using your whole body and your spirit, I think it must be as well, that we can pick up. And you were a Cyberman when you were in that thing, and it was quite easy to act with, because you were very definitely there. And you can tell when people are rehearsing these parts, and they haven't got the costumes on. The ones who are kind of time servers, who are just going through the motions of, I walk in a funny way. That's what Cybermen do. And the ones who are actually acting the part. It's the same in this piece we're doing now, The Ultimate Adventure. The Daleks are extremely good, because the people in them all are, sometimes you can see their faces just through the grill, and they are acting the part. even though they can't be seen. It's the only way you can manipulate those levers with menace, is if you're feeling those feelings inside.
Yeah.
But something that I've noticed working with you is that you are an actor of integrity, of absolute integrity. You're also very disciplined, in the sense that I'm aware that you look after your body, your instrument, your voice, all those sort of things, which put me to shame, because I'm very bad at all that. Intermittently, I think, I must turn up the instrument and all that. But I'm aware that you are someone who is an actor in his entire body and spirit, and that you, even though you will have fun, quotes, like the rest of us, but you are someone with an absolute concentration. You've got very good concentration. I mean, is that something you've always had, or?
Perhaps not. I mean, perhaps I am like that now because I know I have to be. Perhaps from earlier experience in acting, I've lost concentration in such an embarrassing way that I don't want to repeat that. I remember you saying about the last time that you corpsed, you laughed uncontrollably on stage, and that experience made you never wanted to do it again. We're in such a naked position on stage that if we lose our concentration, we can find ourselves in such embarrassment. I remember in the Relapse, a restoration play that I did with Cambridge Theatre Company some time ago, quite a long time ago actually, that I was sitting around backstage. I was off stage for quite a long time, and suddenly I was in conversation with somebody and I heard my cue. I heard the actual, just coming up to the speech that I had to answer, and I didn't have my wig on, so I rushed to my dressing room and put my wig on, and did my buttons up as I went upstairs, and I got on just about a second, perhaps, after I was supposed to speak. And I said my lines, and I thought, everything's all right. And I noticed that the person playing my wife was looking down at my feet and not being able to suppress her giggles. I looked down at my feet, and there I was wearing my open-toed hippie sandals instead of the nice, nicely tooled boots that I should be wearing. And I was in such embarrassment, and I suppose that those kind of things, they happened. They happen whatever you do about them. There is no way that we can be iron-willed all the time. But I suppose my intention to remain in control stems from experiences like that. I envy people like you, perhaps, who let go of that a bit more, have a more free-flowing style on stage. I think it also depends on the part, too. You mentioned before that you liked being on top, you liked being in the position of lead actor because of the way other lead actors have treated you in the past, and because of the way that you don't want to treat other actors. If you're responsible for them, you don't have to treat them like that. But you also said previously to me that you liked being a lead actor because you're on stage all the time, you don't really have to think about it.
That's also true.
You're within the play. And
yes, I find being in the wings can be very distracting.
Yes, and I've played many lead parts, and I know the joy of that. But there are parts which are, and I accept what you say about Carl. I think that he does make his impact. But in truth, he's off stage for more than half the play, and one has got to really summon one's concentration to go back on, to know where one's come from.
Yes.
To, just off stage, when you come on in a rage about having received a message, the thought, perhaps even just in rehearsal, but I try and work through that thought each night. The fact that I've received that message, it's enraged me. All this has happened off stage, I come on with that rage. And I say the lines of the scene. And when I go off, I'm going off to try and get the doctor again. Those things are important to me because they're the way I work. And when you have to go off stage, and then I tend to write and follow my other projects when I'm off stage, the only way to keep coming back into the play is to find that.
You can do that, can you? You can actually go to your dressing room and do other things.
Oh yeah, I do. I've completed so many projects in this. We've had 20 weeks almost on the road now, and it would seem to me, I suppose, such a waste of time not to be doing things. I
find it very hard to concentrate. I played Laertes once in Hamlet, and Laertes is in the second scene, and then has, in the production we did, 2.5 hours off. I did it at Windsor, and I tried to go out, got out of costume, went out of the building, and I couldn't do it. I knew I had 2.5 hours. I could go shopping, I could go and get the cat food and the dog food. I could not do it. So after 2 or 3 days of trying to do that, I gave up. And I ended up just sitting in the dressing room listening to the play most of the time. I couldn't read a book in case I was off. I knew I had 2 hours, but I couldn't concentrate on doing other things. I think that that's another sign of your powers of disciplined concentration. Because I know that I'm not a very concentrated person, I could easily sit there and get engrossed in my book and forget that I had to go back on. In fact, my very first job I ever did, I wasn't off actually, I was on too soon because I thought I was off. I was sitting in the wings at the Arts Theatre in Cambridge, talking as I mean, my mouth flaps.
This story that I said was in the Arts Theatre.
Was it really?
Yeah.
How extraordinary. Well, my first job, second night, and there was a silence on stage. So I thought those metaphorical words one thinks in the and rushed on. My entrance line was, "Are you in there, Father?" So I rushed in saying, "Are you in there, Father?" to a lovely actor called Norman Wooland, who was Horatio to Olivier's Hamlet, a lovely, lovely man. And he was engrossed in some mild osculatory activities with Jill Brown, which I wasn't supposed to know about in the play at all. So I went, "Ugh," and rushed off again, you see, which all I could think of. I then had 3 pages to work out a way of getting back on, which I did with the even more immortal lines, "Are you still in there, Father?" And he said to me, "What was all that about?" Which wasn't a line in the play. And I went, He said, "Speak up, boy, can't hear you." I said, sorry isn't good enough. Why did you come bursting in like that?" And he made me improvise for 2 or 3 minutes. I've never done that again. That was a very salutary lesson. But it's that fear that you're, by act or omission, you're going to do something which tips the whole balance.
Yes. Even if you're on stage the whole time, there is a moment when you can suddenly see that abyss opening up in front of you.
Yes.
The person who's speaking to you is coming to the end of their speech, and you suddenly become conscious of where you are, don't you? Something
Yes.
happens as something
Yes.
clicks in your mind, and you realise that you don't know
That you're an
what
actor
it is.
playing a part and you don't know what the part is at that particular second.
Yeah, yeah.
And what happens 9 times out of 10 is that some little reflex inside you produces it at the last macro second. It pops out. Sometimes it doesn't, and you have to waffle. But I think we've all had that one, yes.
And it can happen at any time, and that's part of the agony, but also I think it's a kind of privilege. I said privilege before, but I do regard acting as a privilege.
Yes, I agree.
And I think to be aware of the fact that nothing is controllable in the end, no matter what we do. You know, the most disciplined, the most concentrated people are always going to fail. It's like the process of writing a computer program. To bring it down to science, there is an axiom in computer programming that there is always a bug in the program, no matter what you do. And we know from recent developments in this century in mathematics that, in fact, any number system which is powerful enough to represent itself actually is incomplete. So that, as a hard science, I find very comforting, relating it to an inexact science like acting, because we're all in the same boat, we're all human, and we're all fallible.
Yes. And I have to say that I do have an instinctive dislike for that kind of acting which is essential to a large extent in farce, which I have done recently, which is so mechanical and repetitive that in order to get the laugh, the great God laugh, you go boom, 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 turn left, turn right, step that way, do that. And I hate that, I think, instinctively, because it somehow implies that we are Cybermen, we're robots, we're automata. And I refuse to allow myself to be that, which is why when I'm doing a part, within certain parameters, I mean, it depends on the show, I do like to have a little looseness so that you can feel free to try something. And if it fails, that you don't try it again. And the people I'm working with feel that way too. And I hate the idea of rigidity. And I have met some people in this business who think that once they have achieved what they think is the right performance, they stick with that performance, come what may. And it's a belief widely held. That's what rehearsal is about. You rehearse and you reach a performance and you repeat it. Yes, but it depends on the definition of what you call a performance. I mean, I think, yes, you repeat that performance in as much as the moves remain the same, and the general through line of the character must remain the same, because you've got to get from A to B at the end of the play. But I like more flexibility. I remember doing one play once in Liverpool with an actor who was now alas dead. And he and I were doing Colin I'm Becoming, and we were the 2 young subalterns in it. And over the period of 4 weeks of playing that part, we almost reversed roles. We were playing the same part, saying the same lines, but we started off as two characters and became developments of those characters by the end. And by the end of the fourth week, we'd almost reversed the nature of the people we were playing, just by the process of doing it. That's the kind of acting that excites me.
Yes. It gives an extra dimension to the word play.
Yes, yes.
And I think at its best, a drama, a play can be that. It's what I said before about your free-flowing instinct. You give yourself up within the parameters of the character and of the story to instinct. And somehow there should be a way to flow with that, to go with the flow. It's a very Taoist notion.
It's a bit selfish. It's a slightly selfish way of behaving, because it does depend to a large extent on other people not doing that.
In a play like this, which is quite a large cast, quite technical, there are limits
Yes.
to what you can do. I tend to liken it to musicians. If you're in a large symphony orchestra, then it's very difficult to do that kind of thing. It's not really required of you. If you're in an opera, you can't do that.
No.
But if you're in a four-hander or a two-hander, it's like being in a chamber piece. And then the musicians in a chamber piece listen to each other, come in.
Yes.
There's a slight change.
Yes.
They've got to play the notes, they've got to play it at the same time as it's been scored, as they've rehearsed it. But there's something about the spirit of it.
Well,
which can change.
it can be more organic.
Yeah.
It can happen each time.
Yeah.
In self-defense, I feel a little bit like a soloist within a symphony orchestra when I'm doing this piece. And
I
that there
think
are
that's fair
little
enough.
passages that I can
Yes, absolutely.
treat as soloist.
As the doctor. I think
The trouble is when the trombone players start thinking they can do the same, then you're in trouble. So sometimes the soloist has to pull himself back a bit so as not to pour encourager les autres.
on that word of French, perhaps we should leave it there.
Can't see how much there is left. There's quite a bit, isn't there? Is it the whole of that black bit in the centre? Oh, well done. Do you ever listen to Loose Ends?
No.
Or it's a Radio 4 programme. Or the other one is that one with, I mean, I'm not by no means comparing us
Stop the Week.
to them. Stop the Week is the other one.
Yeah,
yes.
I love
Do you
Stop
listen?
the
I
Week.
love
used to-
Stop the
I
Week.
haven't listened to it for years.
But we were a kind of third division Stop the Week then, weren't we? With two people.
It's nice.
I love that programme because it's just loose.